Hello, GOAT format duelists. I wanted to do some GOAT format deck guides, and I figured I would start with one of my favorites, which is Reasoning Gate. This deck is very fun and pretty underplayed, probably one of the most underplayed decks in GOAT format for 2025. So let's go ahead and get started. And yeah, by the way, this is a PowerPoint. You know why? I am role playing as someone from the year 2005 when people actually liked PowerPoint. But anyways, brief disclaimer. I'm just sort of covering like the standard, chaos type Reasoning Gate decks. I'm not covering like the Stein limiter removal versions. I'm not covering like the spell economics, Democ loop type Reasoning Gate decks. I kind of like consider those to be their own decks. Like those decks are good, don't get me wrong, and I will probably have a guide on those too at some point, but yeah, we're not going to go over that. What Reasoning Gate is that it's a combo deck, right? It's not a card advantaged base deck. Sometimes you can win with card advantage, like maybe you go Pot of Greed plus Dark Magician of Chaos and kind of just bully your opponent because you have more cards. But 9 times out of 10, it is an OTK deck, right? We're putting a bunch of monsters into play at once and killing our opponent with them. So the main game plan of the deck is first few turns, hey, stall, use goats, use meta to block some damage, and then at some point it's like, hey, I've got a bunch of ways to put things into play. I got a bunch of reasonings and monster gates and dimension fusions, and boom, we go off, kill our opponent. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to talk about some of the core cards in the Reasoning Gate deck. This should be pretty quick. The actual sort of like core engine, the cards that you use to kill your opponent, Reasoning, Monster Gate, Dimension Fusion. You play 3 copies of all of those. I think occasionally I have seen some lists that only play 2 Dimension Fusion, but that is a very non-standard choice that I don't really see much of a reason to do. So yeah, I'm going to say 3 of each of these. And then we have Chaos Monsters. You got to play 1 BLS, cards broken. Chaos Sorcerer, you play 2 to 3. I'd say it's like kind of a 50-50 split. Like there are definitely some good lists that play only 2. 3 is a little more standard though. And I did add the Soul and Purity of Light there as being a 5th Chaos Monster if you want it. It does kind of the same thing that Chaos Sorcerer does, where if you activate like a Reasoning, you'll mill past the Soul of Purity and Light and then it'll be in your grave. But that kind of requires you to build your deck slightly differently. You probably want like more lights, i.e. the 3rd Sacred Crane. So yeah, that's kind of a non-standard choice, but it is an option. And then you have like the actual cards that you're trying to put into play with Reasoning and Monster Gate. So these are some examples. This is not necessarily like an exhaustive list, and I'm not saying like, oh, you have to play all of these. These are just kind of like the options. The Dark Magician of Chaos, the Jinzo, and the Sacred Crane, those are kind of the 3 that like you have to play. Every Reasoning Gate list has the 1 Democ, the 1 Jinzo, and the 2 Sacred Cranes. All of those cards are really good. And you would like want to play 3 Sacred Cranes, but it seems like everyone and their mother just calls level 4, so you typically only play 2. I think Blowback Dragon is a really underrated option. Not a lot of people will call level 6 on Reasoning unless they're maybe like playing a burn deck and they're scared of Jinzo. So I like that, and it's not a hard once per turn, so you can do things like use the effect and Dimension Fusion it back into play, use the effect again. Some people play like a 1 of Fusler. I mean, I think it's fine, but I think they're usually better choices. I mean, again, like no one calls level 7 on Reasoning, which is nice, but as a standalone card, I don't think it does a whole lot. Like, yeah, you can meta it into level 7, but like, that's not amazing. 1 Air Knight is pretty common. You don't see it as much anymore. It's definitely better in a meta where like Scapegoat is more common, and maybe you like True Nade, your opponent plays Goats, and then you put an Air Knight into play and just dealing some damage and drawing some cards. That can be nice. Like, if you're really kind of just going for an OTK, Air Knight doesn't really do a whole lot because drawing a card doesn't matter. Like, what matters is can you kill your opponent or not? Which is why I will say, I mean, again, it's not like super common, but you can play Zaborg as like the level 5 light instead of Air Knight if you think like no one's playing Scapegoat and there are a lot of Chaos decks instead. Again, this is not like an exhaustive list. Like, there are other options you can play. Like, you can play like Dark Ruler Hades. I don't think it's that great. You can play something like an Injection Fairy Lily. But yeah, the important thing to note here is that you don't want too many of these. I say 4 to 7 in total. Really, you want to aim for the lower side of that, right? a lot of the top Reasoning Gate lists just play like 4 or 5 hits, which I think is good. I think like 7 would be pushing it. I think you can go to like 6 if you want like a little more flexibility perhaps. But yeah, you want to aim on the low side here because you want your Reasoning and Monster Gate to mill a bunch of cards. You want to see your Dark Magician of Chaos as quickly as possible, which of course, mathematically you'll see it faster if you have fewer Reasoning Gate hits in your deck. Card draw, not too much to say here. We got like some staples. The upstarts and jars are more popular. As I say, you could play 0 to 4 jars. That's because you can also play like a Reckless Greed as a 4th jar of greed if you want it. We will see some lists that play like 2 upstart, 3 jars. Card destruction, also pretty good. You might think like, well, it's a -1, but like this deck doesn't really care about -1s. What you want is like, if you just opened a pile of trash and a card destruction, sometimes the card destruction, in a way, like it can be kind of like a second graceful charity in that, hey, I'm going to draw cards and then I'm going to put some cards from my hand into the grave, which is obviously combo fuel. So most builds play the card destruction, but you don't have to necessarily. And then Spell or Trap removal. Heavy Storm, you gotta play that. It's Heavy Storm. True Nade, you see most people going for like 2 to 3 copies. I think you can get away with like only playing 1. True Nade has some combos that we're going to go over. MST, like you can also play. It can be like a little better against the Chaos decks where you want to like end phase, hit their Raigeki break, end phase, hit their Jar Greed, something like that. But usually people don't play MST. And I also put Decree on here. I mean, no one really plays Decree, but in theory, there would be nothing stopping you from playing it. Reasoning Gate plays like almost no traps. So Decree, like the only downside of the card is that you have to wait a turn to activate it. And a lot of these Reasoning Gate decks are very, very fast. So like you don't want to go like, oh, I'm going to set Decree and then activate it next turn. Usually you'd prefer to have Giant True Nade just because it's like, hey, it clears everything right now. And then, yeah, some more kind of staples. You got to play Pre. It combos with Giant True Nade, which is nice. Monster Reincarnation, you basically play 1 as like sort of a combo piece that you can get back with Democ, which we'll talk about more later. Call, you usually also play 1 as well. In theory, like, again, you don't have to play it. Like, one way of looking at it would be like, oh, it's too slow. In reality, though, it's really nice because if you get back Crane, like, you're essentially going +1. You can get back Jinzo, which is nice. Like, you can chain it to your opponent's trap and get back Jinzo, which is really cool. And Dark Magician Chaos, well, that's, like, the most broken monster in this deck. So if that's ever in your grave, well, you want Call to get it back. So, yes, a little slow, but also very strong. And then we have some ways to stop our opponent from killing us because, again, this is like a combo deck where you're just kind of, the first few turns, you're kind of just trying to stop damage until you have a critical mass of combo pieces. So Scapegoat, I often like to say like Scapegoat is the most important card in Reasoning Gate deck. I put 0 to 3 just because I'm trying not be biased. Like there have been some winning Reasoning Gate decks in the past that have played 0 Scapegoat. I would always play 3 because it just does so much. It stops damage. It combos with your Monster Gate. It combos with your meta. If you play like Enemy Controller, it combos with that as well. So to me, like I would play 5 Scapegoat if it was legal. But yeah, if, I don't know, maybe you think that everyone is playing Azura Priests and Air Knights and you don't want to play 3. I don't know. Then we got like Mirror Torrential Ring, which you can play some combination of those as well. I generally like Torrential and Ring more because they don't die to Breaker. And realize too, like the first few turns, you're going to have like no monsters on the field. So Torrential is like really nice. It's almost like a Raigeki. It's a very, very one-sided card in this deck. Ring I like too because sometimes you're using it defensively. We're like, oh, I'm going to ring my opponent's Kaiku or something to stop them from hitting me. But other times you can use it offensively, like, hey, I hit my opponent for 6,000 and then I set Ring and kill them. So very versatile card. In a meta where there's like a ton of aggro, I think you could main deck Mirror Force, especially because like once people know that you're on Reasoning Gate deck, like if it's a tournament or like maybe it's an IRL tournament and people can spectate and see what deck you're on and then know for the next round, or if it's like an online tournament where people, I don't know, they get to see your deck list. The thing is, if people know you're on Reasoning Gate, they're going to be very aggressive because they know that if they give you too much time, you are just going to combo kill them. So they're not going to play around Mirror Torrential very much, especially because most Reasoning Gate decks don't play it. So what you can kind of do if you want is you can play both Mirror and Torrential and say, hey, you have to actually respect my back rows. You can't just summon all of your monsters and attack me every turn. Then we have like some ways to push through damage. Snatch and Vortex, you basically have to play one of. I think historically, maybe we've seen some Reasoning Gate decks that haven't played Snatch, but it's pretty much a staple. Like, yes, your opponent can MST it, but part of the nice thing about Snatch is that since it's an equip spell, you can take your opponent's Dark Bolter, which would otherwise be like a very annoying card for you to deal with. Vortex you just use to clear whatever your opponent has. It might be a field full of Scapegoats, or maybe like 2 Gravekeeper Spies, or, 2 Chaos Monsters. It's just, hey, get whatever you have out of play. And the discard doesn't really matter because your deck doesn't care about card advantage, and you're trying to put monsters in your grave anyways. And then you could play Brain or Econ. I think Econ is a little more popular right now. I like Brain more just because, like, you don't have to jump through as many hoops to activate it. It's easier to have 800 life than it is to have a monster in play. Econ, of course, like, it has the mode where you can just turn something to defense to stop your opponent from hitting you, but you're mostly using it for the mode to take control of a monster. Both are good, though. I like playing one, like just one Brain or one Econ. This isn't something where you want to, like, go crazy and play a bunch of them. And then, yeah, I didn't know like what category to put meta in. So it's like, yeah, also play this. It's interesting about meta because like when Reasoning Gate first entered the GOAT format meta, like, I don't know what it was, 5-7 years ago, most Reasoning Gate decks played like 3 metas. But today what you actually see is that a lot of Reasoning Gate decks play 0 metas. So you could really play like kind of whatever number you want. I don't like 3. I mean, in fact, I was one of like the first people to advocate for not playing 3 because it is a little situational in the sense that like, it's not what people would call like a starter card, right? It's more of an extender. So if you have nothing in play, like if you, it just kind of does nothing. So I think 3 is too many. I like playing at least 1 though. Like we're going to see a list that has 0, but what I like is sort of having a mishmash of different one-ofs in a deck like this so that we can say get it back with DMOC, because often what you're doing with DMOC is that you want to like meta your DMOC, get a Gatling Dragon, blow up your opponent's monsters, and then Dimension Fusion your DMOC back. That is like a very strong combo. So me personally, I would play 1 or 2 copies of meta, but if you want, you could play 0 or 3, although I really would not recommend 3. I'm just going to do 2 example deck lists, very different deck lists, just because I want people to get a sense of what directions you can take this deck in. This is sort of more of a all-in list, and you know what? Let me get rid of my face so you can see everything here. You'll notice here, we technically have 5 Reasoning Gate targets, but we're playing 3 Toon Tables to search Toon Cannon. So really most of the time we're only gonna have like 4 Reasoning Gate targets, right? 2 Crane, 1 Jinzo, 1 DMOC. The Reasoning Gate lists that sort of play fewer monsters, they tend to be like more linear and more all in on the OTK. And that's totally fine. I definitely think that works. I think that's a valid way to play this deck. Again, I would like to see like just 1 meta in here. Maybe cut like a Draw Greed for the 1 meta. Because again, I think it's kind of like a nice versatile DMOC target. But you'll notice here we kind of have like all of the draw effects. We have the 2 upstarts, the 3 Jar Greeds, the card destruction, no Reckless Greed, but realistically, I think you could play Reckless Greed if you wanted to. I just don't know what I'd cut for it. The Toon Cannon, it's like, hey, we can either search it out and like tribute it to Monster Gate. Toon Cannon, you can also like tribute your Scapegoat tokens and deal damage that way. The next list is my own list, and I'm not going to say like, oh, you have to play this list. I like this style personally. A lot of people call level 4 on Reasoning, I've noticed, and the last builds, it's like, hey, 3 out of 5 of your Reasoning hits are level 4, whereas here it's 2 out of 6. I like blowback, and this is kind of like the opposite of the all-in build. You notice here, we're not playing Jar Greed, and we're playing cards like Ring and Torrential instead, being like a little more defensive. Notice here we've got the 2 metas, and a lot of times you're kind of just like going meta on goats, get 1,000 Eyes Restrict, suck up, I don't know, your opponent's set Magician if they something, and just kind of sit around for a few turns, right? Just going, hey, you can't attack me, I'm gonna stall, and then, oh, look, I've got like 2 Monster Gates now. Okay, I'm gonna Monster Gate my 1,000 Eyes away, go into a blowback, blow up one of your cards. Oh, I'm gonna Monster Gate my goat token now, go into a Sacred Crane, draw a card, tribute my Sacred Crane for a Jinzo or something, and so on. I'm just kind of spitballing here. And you also notice we only have 1 True Nade here. Me personally, like, I feel like with Jinzo and Blowback, I've never missed the second and third copy of Trunade. I've never said to myself, like, oh god, I really wish this deck had more Trunades. Like, there are a couple of matchups like Burn, or I guess even Warriors to a large extent, where you'd really like to have more Trunades, but we can just side for that. Against like the standard Chaos list, or even against like a GOAT control deck, we don't really need the Trunades that much. So again, this is kind of like another style that you can take the deck. This is still a combo deck, right? Like this isn't about like, oh, we're just trying to go +1 with like Air Knight and Blowback. It's like, we can do that, but we're still an OTK deck first and foremost. And then before like I sort of talk about like side decking and stuff, I think it's good that we talk about the strengths and weaknesses, because that helps put like the side deck into context. And what I've noticed about this deck, I play a lot of combo decks in GOAT format. What I've noticed about this one in comparison to other combo decks is that we don't really care that much about our opponent's interaction. Now, this is not like an exhaustive list, right? We don't really care about like Mirror Force or Raigeki Break or Book of Moon or even like Trap Dust Shoot. It's like, okay, they're going to Dust Shoot us and put back like our Sacred Crane or put back our Chaos Sorcerer or something. And for the most part, we're just like, yeah, don't care. What we really care about is like monsters, things like Kaiku, or things like Tribe in the main phase 2 to like blow up all of our GOAT tokens. Most of like the spell and traps that people play, Ring of Destruction, etc. We just don't care about that stuff that much. We can kind of ignore it in one way or the other, or at least not let our opponent get too much value out of those cards. And secondly, it's like, I will say it's like often, a lot on my channel, I advocate for decks that aren't popular. And people will comment and say things like, oh, this deck isn't popular, like, therefore it must not be good. Whereas I kind of see it like the opposite way, right? Like, in an ideal world, right? If I have a deck that I'm going to play, in an ideal world, I would want that to be like the least popular deck in the format, because then people aren't trying to beat it. And as of, 2025, that is where we are right now. We are going to talk about like some of the weaknesses, but the strengths are that like the cards that beat us aren't really that common. And, I will say, in comparison to other combo decks, we have a few more options, ways of sort of manipulating our board and dealing with our opponent's board than other combo decks, right? Like if you're playing even something like a Cyberstein deck, which I know are very popular now, the deck is like kind of just trying to do one thing. It's like you have to have 5,000 life points. You have to clear your opponent's back rows. You have to do like all of these things. Whereas this, it's like, I don't really care that much, like if our opponent has 1 back row or 5 back row, or if they have a monster or they don't have a monster, or if they're playing Scapegoat or not playing Scapegoat. Regardless of what deck our opponent might be on, we have a lot of options to deal with that. Like, we don't really get hard countered by really any common main deck cards. And I will say too, it's like, just because we have so much room in the side deck, and really in the main deck too, it's like, we just have a lot of tools to beat like the other alt-win decks. Like for example, there's like the Drain Burn deck, and if you're just playing a Reasoning Gate deck with like 3 Trunades, you just absolutely destroy that deck. And then you have like Decrees in the side. Even some of the other combo decks, maybe like Stein or whatever, it's like, if you're up against a Stein deck, it's like, you just have to attack them for 3,000, which is pretty easy for this deck. I do think it's a pretty decent combo deck at beating the other combo decks. Weaknesses, these are mostly just like individual cards. Kaiku could be annoying. It depends on like how you build your deck, right? Like if we go back to, the different builds, you'll notice this build like doesn't have a ton of outs to Kaiku, right? It's like, okay, we can kill a Kaiku with a Lightning Vortex, and that's like kind of about it. I mean, you could maybe like Reasoning a Sacred Crane into play, and then like Tribute for Jinzo attack over the Kaiku, but we don't have a lot of outs to Kaiku. Whereas like this build, we have a few more, in that we can meta our GOAT token, go into Thousand Eyes, take their Kaiku, we can Torrential to kill the Kaiku, we can Ring to kill the Kaiku, we can Brain Control the Kaiku, which is really nice. So, a couple more outs. So it kind of like depends on your build a little. Jowgen the Spiritualist is another really annoying one. If anything, I think Jowgen is like, of all the cards on this list, it's probably like the worst one to have to deal with. But luckily, again, like people don't really side Jowgen right now. Like I know maybe there are some Chaos Return decks that play Shining Angel and then side like a Jowgen as a Shining Angel target, but that is like a super small percentage of the meta. Spell Canceller is another one. Spell Canceller, I mean, people will try to summon it in mirrors. I mean, that is pretty typical. Some people will side it. I've definitely seen it sided before. Last Warrior from Another Planet is another one that we can be concerned about, or Dark Balter. So going against Goat Control, like, we would rather face like a Chaos deck than a Goat Control deck, because a Goat Control deck, they can like meta a level 5 into a Dark Balter, or if they're playing the version of Goat Control that plays Fusilier, then they can meta their Fusilier into a Last Warrior from Another Planet. And both of those, like, we don't want to see. Like, again, we do have outs. It's not that we're just completely dead to those cards, but the outs are pretty few and far between. You know, again, people do play Stein right now, so people can just Stein into a Last Warrior from Another Planet. That is something that you need to be prepared for. I will also say, like, one of the things that keeps people from playing this deck, I've talked about this a little before, but I feel like people just don't like RNG mechanics in GOAT format. People just want to think that it is this hyper skillful format where they can just sort of control the universe and brute force their way to win. I mean, in reality, that's just not how card games work. Like, RNG is just part of the game. But some people, it's like, you will have those hands where you have two reasonings and you're like, okay, as long as my opponent doesn't call both these reasonings correctly, I'm gonna win. And then they just call them both correctly and you lose. It can happen. Like, I've been on both sides of the equation, right? I've lost games because my opponent called my reasoning correctly. I've won games because I've called my opponent's reasoning correctly. It's just part of the game. And if you keep watching, by the way, you will see that we are going to have like a cool treat, a little sort of guide on how to call reasoning. So, you know, keep watching. How to play Reasoning Gate? It's like, I would love to just give you some complicated guide, like, oh, here's exactly what you do when. It's actually not as hard as people think it is. Like, I will say, of the decks in GOAT format, when I watch other people play, I do see a lot of people play this deck incorrectly, but I think fundamentally it's not that hard of a deck to play. I think people overcomplicate it. Basically, all you're just trying to do is OTK, right? So you look at your hands and you run the math and you go like, okay, I've got whatever it is. Oh, I got a Reasoning, a Monster Gate, a Dimension Fusion. Can I OTK my opponent? And if the answer is yes, well then OTK then, right? Pretty obvious. Sometimes, maybe you're thinking, I'm not sure if I can OTK. But if you could make like an overwhelming board and attack your opponent for a lot of damage, you might want to do that as well, right? Maybe you put like a DMOC and a Jin Zone to play, you attack your opponent for 52, and now you're negating all of their chops, and you go, okay, I think that's good enough in this situation. I think my opponent's going to have a tough time dealing with that. But if you can't do either of those things, then basically just do nothing, right? Set your Scapegoat, set your Jar Greed, set your Call the Haunted or whatever it is. That's it, right? It's either, I can either pop off or I can't pop off. Putting one Sacred Crane into play is not popping off. So if that's all you can do, then just save your resources. It is literally that simple. And that is why, like, this deck can be a little harder for some people to play than something like a Cyberstein deck, right? Because it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, like, hey, I shouldn't summon my Cyberstein until I have a way to kill my opponent with it, right? Like, no one's just going to summon their Cyberstein into like 4 back rows without like a way to deal with them. And yet I will see Reasoning Gate players do that kind of thing with this deck, where they're just kind of like go, oh, I'll play one Reasoning and say go. Oh, I'll play one Monster Gate and say go. That is not how you want to play the deck. You are trying to accumulate a critical mass of resources, and you're fine with taking damage, right? Like, okay, your opponent attacks you with a Dekochi. Who cares? Take 14. Oh, they're attacking me with 2 spies. Okay, take 24. Who cares? Oh, you know, they're putting a Blade Knight and a Kaiku into play and they're attacking me. Okay, block those 2 hits with Scapegoat. Like, don't waste all of your resources. I mean, that's probably the most fundamental rule of GOAT format as a whole, and yet Reasoning Gate players, a lot of them don't seem to get it. I will go over like some key combos. You know, I know some of the more like advanced players watching will be like, oh, come on, this stuff is obvious, but you know, some newer people might not know. Dark Magician of Chaos is probably like it is the most important combo piece for the deck. It is not like a once per turn. I know they've like errated this card, but in GOAT format, it's just, hey, you summon it, you get a spell back, and you can do that as many times as you want, right? As long as you keep summoning it. So what you often are doing with Dark Magician of Chaos is you're putting into play, you're like getting back a Dimension Fusion with its effect, and then you're gonna like Monster Gate your Dark Magician of Chaos, it gets banished, then you Dimension Fusion, put your Dark Magician of Chaos back into play. You can even use the effect, get back Dimension Fusion again. Oh, now I'm gonna meta my Dark Magician of Chaos into a Gatling, Dimension Fusion again. So like, it's not what I'd call like a Dimension Fusion loop per se, but you get like a lot of, you can get a big extended combo by just repeatedly putting Dark Magician of Chaos into play from your banish pile all in one turn. Second one, I mean, this one's a little obvious, which is Brain Control Monster Gate. I mean, need I say more? Combos with enemy controller, Snatch Steal, or whatever. But that's one of the nice things about Brain Control is like, hey, if you don't have Scapegoat as a way to like get your Monster Gate going, well, you can just Brain Control your opponent's guy. Another big one, and part of the reason that people really like to play lots of Giant Trinades is that Giant Trinade combos with Pre and Call. Pre in particular, because it's an equipped spell, and when the Premature Burial goes to your hand, the monster stays in play. So you can like Premature your Sacred Crane, Trunade your Premature, then Premature your Jinzo, Trunade my Premature, and so on. With Call, it doesn't work quite as well, but you can kind of do the same thing. For example, if you use Call to like put Jinzo into play, you can then Trunade your Call back to your hand. Well, of course, then you won't be able to activate Call because you have a Jinzo in play, but maybe later you can. You can even call on Sacred Crane, draw an extra card, Trunade the Call back to your hand, and then call the Sacred Crane the next turn, kind of get some extra card draws that way. So that is something to know. I mean, that is a big reason they play Trunade. And then Monster Reincarnation, because I think a lot of people, like, it's not entirely obvious why this card is so good. No other deck in GOAT format really plays Monster Reincarnation, but here you're kind of using it to combo with Dimension Fusion in the sense that, like, you're going to mill a BLS or a Sorcerer from your Reasonings and Monster Gates, ideally BLS because that one's better, and then you Monster Reincarnation, bring BLS back to your hand. Keep in mind, Monster Reincarnation has a cost of 1 discard. So if you have a BLS in your grave, but like you're missing the light or dark, well, then you can Monster Reincarnation, discard that, add the BLS back to your hand, summon it, banishing the thing that you just discarded, and then Dimension Fusion it back into play. That is a really big one. The side deck, this is not like necessarily exhaustive. You'll notice that I'm not trying to be like too prescriptive and say like, oh, you have to play this exact combination of cards, but we have a few categories. One, I just call level mix-ups, which is the idea being that in game one, you can see what levels your opponent is calling on Reasoning if you activated one, and then side in such a way that your reasonings get better. So the example I have here, although certainly not the only example, is that if you notice your opponent never calls level 8 on Reasoning, you can side in Creator, which is very, very good. If you notice that your opponent never calls level 4 on Reasoning, well then you can side in the 3rd Sacred Crane. Or if, for whatever reason, you think, well, they're never going to call level 5, and I have a good level 5 in my side deck, you can put that in as well. Like, maybe you decide, oh, I'm not going to main Air Knight, but I'm going to side it against, say, GOAT control decks, and then no, they're not going to call 5 on Reasoning. There's lots of room in your side deck, so it's like, yeah, you're already going to have a lot of spell or trap removal in your main deck, but you might as well side some more, right? Like, Decree being the main one. Usually people don't main Decree, but they do almost always side it, so you can bring that in against a burn deck. Maybe Warriors, it depends, but, burn in particular. Also, those, if you're not maining something like Mirror Force, usually it's pretty good to side it against decks like Warriors or Earth Aggro. They're just going to be hyper aggressive, and you want to have ways to stop that. There's also like Swords of Revealing Light as another potential anti-aggro card. You could even try something like Messenger Apiece, but that card is not really as good. And then also typically you have like some anti-combo stuff. Here I have Delinquent Duo. It doesn't have to be Delinquent Duo. It could be Spell Canceller. It could be Cyberstein. It could be Threatening Roar, but you're going to have room to side those cards, so you might as well. And then I just put this slide because I knew someone was going to ask in the comments. They always do, oh, what goes in the Fusion deck? Everything. GOAT format has an unlimited Fusion deck, put every card. I will say, like, for the IRL players, one of the advantages of not playing any metas or Cybersteins is that you don't need a Fusion deck, and then, like, that'll save you money, like, maybe. Because, like, Gatling Dragon, I think, is one of the more expensive Fusions, and that is one that you have to play if you're playing meta in Cyberstein, but if you don't play those cards, well, then you don't need it. I knew people would like this. Some people might hate it, but people always debate, like, oh, if my opponent reasonings, what level should I call? And they're different arguments. Like, oh, should you call like the higher impact card, like Dark Magician of Chaos, meaning level 8? Or should I call the more frequent level, the one that is more likely to actually occur, that being Sacred Crane? And you can actually calculate the EV of one or the other, right? So you just calculate the left side here, and then you calculate the left side, you calculate the right side, and then you see which one is greater than the other. So if the left side is greater, you call the first reasoning level. If the right side is later, you call the second one. So I will have an example because I know people will be confused by this. But basically, all you need to know to figure out which is the better level to call is, and again, some of this is going to be guesswork. I'm not saying this is like an exact science, but if you're considering, for example, between 8 and 4, well, how many level 8s do they play? That's R1. How many level 4s do they play? That's R2. And then the W's are all the odds of winning the game if you call correctly or don't call correctly. So W11 is that you call the first reasoning level and are correct. W12 is that you call the first reasoning level, but you get it wrong and the second one comes into play. And then these are basically the same thing, right? 2-2 is you call the second level and the second level comes, you're correct. And 2-1 is you call 2 and the first one comes up, you are incorrect. And I know some people are going to be like, okay, this is way too intimidating. What kind of nerd is actually going to do this in a game? But it's actually like not very difficult to do. So I'll have an example, right? And I picked an example that is like fairly reasonable and practical, which is you go, okay, I'm considering calling 8 or 4. And I know they have 1 Dark Magician of Chaos, 2 Sacred Cranes, and I think that if I call level 8 and I am correct, I am going to win the game 60% of the time. And I think that if I call level 8 and they get a Sacred Crane, I'm only going to win 40% of the time. Then you estimate, okay, if I call level 4 and I'm correct, well, probably 60% chance of winning either way. But if I call level 4 and the Dark Magician of Chaos comes into play, well, that card is a lot more powerful, so I think I'm only going to win 10% of the time. And then you just plug that into the formula here. You just do, okay, 1 times 60 plus 2 times 40, that's 140. 2 times 60 plus 1 times 10, that's 130. And then in this particular example, again, you can say, well, I don't think those numbers are realistic, whatever. But in this particular example, because 140 is greater than 130, you should call the first, reasoning level R1, which is level 8. To wrap things up, I was going to have some reasoning gate replays that we could talk about and say, hey, here's how to play a game. But I actually already did that in another video. So if you want to see a Reasoning Gate deck in action and have me critique the plays of the Reasoning Gate player, talking about a lot of these concepts from today, then you should go watch this video right here. It is really educational.